it accepts as acceptable behavior, who it esteems as experts, how it defines success or worthiness in leadership in our sector, and who we choose to fund in order to really walk its talk about equity and to really embody our name, the love of humanity. Since 2018, Decolonizing Wealth has ignited an era of reckoning in our sector with its calls to decolonize, redistribute, and reparations. We ignited a global movement of decolonizers in philanthropy to take action, actions that were supercharged by the compounding humanitarian crises over the following couple of years. There was the pandemic, which upended millions of lives and wreaked havoc because of the government's negligent and dangerous response. And in the middle of all this, we witnessed a horrific murder of George Floyd at the hands of the Minneapolis Police Department that fueled a global movement to declare that Black Lives Matter. In terms of philanthropic response at that moment, I was hopeful. I saw radical shifts in who was receiving money and how money was being deployed. While imperfect, there was a clear sense of who we were for a moment and what we had to do. And the global impact of these poly-crises, philanthropy also outside of the US seemed to be inspired by our responses here, and it opened the door for our work to influence giving in many places. We also did a Philanthropy So White in the UK. DWP and many of our colleagues in this work grew rapidly during that time. We unapologetically moved millions of dollars to Black and Indigenous communities, and our reparative philanthropy tools and resources influenced over 600 million new dollars towards racial and economic justice. And now here we are. The world has flipped again on its axis. But this time, polycrisis doesn't feel like a sufficient description to describe what feels like the collapse of the empire and the violent reign of white supremacy terror that we are facing, that will take generations for us to recover from, assuming that we all survive it. The philanthropic response has been sporadic and has felt uncoordinated in many ways. Some who stood by our communities boldly declaring that Black Lives Matter, who came out of the woodwork to partner and support Indigenous groups, have grown silent. They've run for the hills, scrubbing their websites of language that refers to historically marginalized communities, for example, not returning our emails when we ask for help, and caving to the agenda of the government far before actual demands and regulations exist to do so. Fear, a key strategy and tactic of white supremacy, seems on one hand to be working. Sadly, while there's been so much progress, we are once more stifled, raising the question, were folks really in solidarity with us in the first place, or was it all performative? Is anyone willing to really fight, to put their own skin in the game and sacrifice whatever it will take for truth, justice, liberation, and democracy? Where are the real philanthropic patriots? But I am not without hope. There is a window and opportunity before us. I don't think that this is the beginning of something. I think it's the end. It's the end of white supremacy in so many ways. And perhaps what we're seeing and experiencing is just the last throes of a kicking and screaming system that doesn't want to die. So today, here we are again with an audience of thousands of you, where we will explore the unique journeys of white leaders in this work. White leaders who have stood up and have taken on this charge to address white supremacy in philanthropy and to strive towards racial equity. We are excited and thankful for our guests who are coming forward to talk about what inspired their calling as leaders to address white supremacy through their philanthropic leadership. We'll talk about what they consider their role as leaders to be in the sector and how they have dealt with mistakes and criticisms perhaps along the way, and where they go to resources to support in their journey. This is really important because we need white people to be doing their work and to take on ownership and be in solidarity with us as we work towards a sector that is more just and more equitable. For far too long, the work of racial justice in philanthropy has been championed by BIPOC folks, and for good reason. But today I'm passing the mic and sharing this stage with folks because this is an opportunity for white leaders to speak to other white leaders and to collect their people in ways that only they can and must do. I'm really inspired by the leadership of our panelists today and appreciate their willingness to speak up and out in this space, which increasingly feels risky to do so. After our conversation, my dear friend and colleague, Vanessa Daniel, a new author of the book, Unrig the Game, What Women of Color Can Teach Everyone About Winning, and a senior fellow at Decolonizing Wealth Project, will provide some closing reflections and wisdom, bringing accountability and perspective into this conversation. But before we dive in, I want to invite you all to participate on social media. We are live streaming right now from Decolonizing Wealth's YouTube page. So everyone, feel free to take that link. We'll drop it in the chat and send it to every person you know that needs to hear this conversation right now. We'll also be, of course, saving this conversation there on our page so you can refer back to it later, and we'll follow up with some additional resources as well. You can also keep the conversation going on social media using the hashtags decolonizing wealth and hashtag philanthropy so white. All right, are we ready to dive in? Let's all take a collective breath, connecting our heads, our hearts, our spirits. Let's invite grace, solidarity, love, truth, kindness, and boldness into this conversation. This is a place to grow, to be inspired, and to be challenged in this moment. So without further ado, I want to invite our speakers to join me. Please note that Anna Fink, who is the executive director of the Amalgamated Charitable Foundation, will not be able to join us today. She fell ill this morning, so we regret that. But we are happy to be joined by Glenn Galick, who is the CEO of the Stupski Foundation, and Richard Besser, the president and CEO of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Hey, welcome, guys.
Thank you. Hey there. Great to be here, Edgar.
Good to see y'all. So this is a little bit of a mantle for right now. We do apologize for that. We really attempted to be gender expansive, but we are so thrilled that we will have Vanessa to join us in just a moment here. So thanks again for joining us. We really appreciate it. So looking forward to this important conversation today. To get us started, we just want to hear a little bit from you about who you are. We know you through your former roles and your leadership, but let's get a little bit more personal today. We often at DWP ask, who's your people, as a way of getting introduced. And so I want to ask you, who are your people that you are from and that you're bringing into this conversation today? Glenn?
Rich, you want to start? You want me to go? Okay. I saw this question. I've answered it a few times. And first of all, let me start by saying thank you, Edgar, for inviting me. And Rich, it's really an incredible honor to be with both of you today. I've never been on a stage or a virtual stage with the two of you. I've watched you speak and followed your work. And Edgar, your book had such an impact on me. So I just want to acknowledge that. And thank you for having me today. And I hope I can offer something to the conversation. I appreciate this question. I've thought about who are my people, and I think if the question is one around ancestry and elders and otherwise, I am pretty much a fully European guy. I learned recently, actually, through ancestry, that all my life I was told I was part Serbian, but it looks like I'm part Turkish more than anything. And it's interesting how ethnicity and identity get kind of mushed around and swirled around as people move across the globe. My grandfather, who is where my name is from, actually came to the United States illegally through Texas, and he changed his name from Garalejevic to Galich to come off as more American. And I found that story really interesting. As I was growing up, my father would tell me when my grandfather was officially made a citizen of the United States, that the judge or whoever was doing the proceedings said, "You were always an American from the day you set foot in here." And there's something about that I find interesting is in this current climate, that this country formally was one that really accepted people both in economic and political refugee status, and he certainly was both. But we are really retreating from that today, and we just want to always remind myself of that. That's why I'm here. And for me, I've always had an orientation toward justice. My graduate work is in human rights. Um, but ironically, as I got into I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead here. So I'll just say those are my people. I think my grandfather being the most influential for me in my own path and why I'm here today.
When Rich, who's your people?
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Glenn. And likewise, thanks so much for this, Edgar. I do a lot of speaking, and this is a really unique construct and conversation. And it's a real privilege to be here. Thinking about I don't often think about who my people are. And I think about my people in a couple ways. One, my relatives on both sides are Eastern European Jews, immigrant stock to the U.S. One grandma came over when she was 2 or 3 from area that's now part of the war in Ukraine. She was in Philadelphia and worked in sweatshops in Philly and got a scholarship to school and became a nurse and picked my grandfather off of the wards as the person she was going to marry, and no one could say no to her. And my family's been very heavy in healthcare and service, and that is where my desire, I think, to be in a career where I felt I was helping people became part of it. The other way I think about my people are public health people. I'm very aligned in terms of my worldview on the power of public health to help work towards a better world. And thinking about your introduction to this, so much of that is under threat right now.
Absolutely. No, thank you for sharing that. I've really learned in sort of these multiracial spaces where we're having conversations about this, it's really important for us all to be connected to our history, where we come from. And, for white folks who, in America especially, sometimes that's gotten lost as we've all been taking on this identity of being American. We're all something else. We all come from other places. And in many cases, there's a similarity in our cultures and traditions when you look back far enough and kind of see how things were before now. So thank you for sharing that in terms of who you are and coming into this space. I want to ask you both next just a little bit about your journey when it comes to moments in your life where you've had these aha moments, you may want to call them, where you were convicted or politicized to really use your privilege as white men to step up in your leadership and your commitment to be a part of this movement to advance racial equity in the world. Anything you can share there, whatever order you all want to go in?
Well, I'll jump in. And I'm going to focus on my time in philanthropy. I've kind of had chapters in my career, all related to public health, but a big chunk in government service, and then in media, and now here at RWJF. And there are three stories that I want to share on that. The first was when I first arrived at the foundation. I'd never worked in philanthropy before. Someone had sent me a book that had just come out, and it was sitting on my desk, and it's called "I Hear My People Singing," and it's an oral history of the historically Black neighborhood here in Princeton, New Jersey. The foundation's located in Princeton, New Jersey. I grew up in Princeton, New Jersey. My family, my parents are here. I left to go to college and came back 40 years later for this job. And there was this book, and I read it, and there were all these people I knew in the book who had grown up in this incredible neighborhood in Princeton that I, growing up, had heard was, oh, that's a dangerous neighborhood. That's a neighborhood you have to be a little careful about safety in. And reading this book, Paul Robeson grew up in this neighborhood. It was an extremely, it was a neighborhood of professionals who were largely Black because they could not live anywhere else in Princeton, New Jersey. And many of the people there who had professional degrees were worked on Princeton University property as groundskeepers or in the kitchens because they couldn't get jobs that they were qualified for. And it was my first. It was a shock to my system because through the privilege of my whiteness and growing up in Princeton, I had not seen it at all. And so that was the first kind of story I wanted to share. The next occurred the following year at Aspen Ideas Festival. We, for about 10 years, had sponsored something called the County Health Rankings, which ranks health across our nation at the county level across a whole number of different parameters. And the report we were putting out that year was focused on race, place, and health, and the connection, looking at the intersection of those and clearly demonstrating that regardless of where you were, if you look at all the health indicators by race, you will see worse outcomes. And it led to the question of why, and that leads to the question of opportunity for health and barriers to health. And I was going on to a panel at the Aspen Ideas Festival to talk about this, and Maria Hinojosa was the moderator, and Kevin Washington was a panelist. He was the head of the Y. He's a Black man, and the head of the Asian American Health Foundation, Kathy Cochin, was on as well. And it was me. And I was talking to one of our communications officers, who's a Black woman, and I said, "What am I doing on this panel? What do I know about race? I'm a white guy." And she said to me, until white people see racism as a problem that they have a role in solving, we're not going to get anywhere. And she said, embrace your privilege. And it was one of the most liberating things for me to feel that I could go on this stage with my lived experience, which is an experience of extreme privilege, straight, white, male, older, well-off family, educated. I mean, we had done a privilege exercise at Aspen, and my stack was really, really high. And so on the stage, be able to embrace that and then talk about the importance of white people, white leaders, seeing racism as their issue was really incredible. And then the third, and I'll go short on that, was what you lifted up in terms of the murder of George Floyd and the COVID pandemic and the disparate impact of the COVID pandemic on people of color in America. As an epidemiologist, as a public health person, diving into that moment there allowed us as a foundation to really pivot and focus on the role structural racism plays as the biggest barrier to health in America.
Thanks, Rich. And what about you?
Yeah, this is a great question. I've been in philanthropy now for 25 years, so to like Rich, I think that's probably where there's not been much more to my career than that. And a critical part of why I think I'm here today is that in the early part of my career, I led a donor network that really was one of the only ones to live through the turn of the century period, the 2000s, where there was just a lot of donor education programs out there, and TPW at the time continued to sustain itself by training individual donors on how to be so-called strategic in their giving. And I was a big champion of that idea and the intention behind it was very heartfelt, in that it was great to see people who had basically created a tax shelter for charitable purposes actually use it for charitable purposes, to want to be thoughtful about it, which is very unique. Of all the donor education programs on the planet, they serve only 4% of the philanthropic market. Most everybody else is not being thoughtful in how they give, at least as I define it. You might define thoughtful another way. So I was proud to do it, but I was very much championing a donor-centered view. And as time went by, and as I worked in the sector, and as I eventually got into this role of running a foundation, I also was paying attention to the ecosystem around us. And at the time, and it's going on the same trajectory today, the world was getting more and more disparate in terms of wealth, access to wealth, especially in communities of color versus white communities. And if you look at the statistics, while BIPOC communities have seen an increase in wealth, the disparity between white and communities of color is still expanding and growing. And despite having $1.5 trillion of available philanthropic assets in our system that grew during the first half of my career, and we celebrated and celebrate, I was deeply troubled by the fact that disparity continued to grow. And of course, the two things are very related, while philanthropic assets grew. And we'd made no real gains. Lots of talk about strategy. And I started to ask the question, what's at the core of this? And the core of it is that donors, for the most part, are white. And donors come from the same communities I come from, and Rich mentioned, wealthy, privileged, very limited experience. We are very much, as white people, socialized, I think, especially as I've had time to read and learn and read stuff that you've read and really expose myself to the dynamics of our society. Like Rich said, I think lines like that's the dangerous community, lead you to believe that you don't have really a role in this. You just do your best and live your life. And there's this narrative. I'm also a big fan of The Matrix. And I felt like I finally got the red pill at some point, which you call my aha moment. But I was already in a place where I was questioning the practices of our philanthropic sector and wondering, is it healthy for us to have a donor-centered strategic approach, or should we be doing something with more of a community-informed approach? People who are living in these places who really don't get the chance to engage the kind of assets we have here. And of course, your book came out, Edgar, and others at the time, that really started to shake the foundation of my own strong belief in this idea of donor strategy, donor-centered strategy. And, interestingly, Rich, it's so interesting to hear your story, because I too was at a conference, and it was at Stanford. I don't often go to conferences at Stanford, but I was at one. It was put on by the Stanford Social Innovation Review back in 2018, I believe it was. I think I was one of the most of the people in the audience were from nonprofit community-based organizations. I think I was one of only a few foundation leaders there. And the first person to speak was Rashad Robinson. And I felt like he was looking right at me, even though I know he wasn't. I've met him since. I doubt he remembers this. But there was a moment when he looked right over at my table and he said, "We are never going to deal with the situation for Black kids in schools until white people care about them as much as their own." Obviously. And it's embarrassing in many ways to hear an obvious statement and to say to you today that was my aha moment, right? I struggle with that, but it is a reality. It really hit me. And he was followed by 3 leaders of racial justice organizations here in the Bay Area, and they referred to things I had not heard about before. They referred to the nonprofit industrial complex. They said, we don't even they were speaking to an audience that I think really shared their perspective and perhaps didn't know that there were foundation leaders in the audience. So in some ways, I felt like I was getting a chance to be behind the curtain here a little bit. And they were saying, we don't even look to the foundation world for support. And frankly, they're supporting a machinery that just puts us down. We will do this ourselves. I mean, that really got me. I came back to the office that day and I looked at my team and I said, we're changing everything right now. Which if you worked with me, anyone working with me who hears me say that knows that I do tend to move on a dime. And, you know, so we did. We started in very quickly to shift things, and we can talk more about how that played out. But it does speak to the privilege I have as a white leader. I'm in this role I think in many ways because of that fact. I think I was likely hired to be in this position because partly my experience, but my experience the opportunities come in many ways because of my privilege. And then I have this power position to where I can move things on a dime. And that has come with lots of challenges. The foundation's been through a lot. It is not easy to take actions against a culture, a status quo that very much makes the path easier for you to follow. And I do think that that's a huge challenge. There's a broader thing I'll just say and I'll stop. I do think that's a huge challenge for progressive philanthropy because in a moment like this, I think it's a really clear example. It is so much cheaper and easier and efficient to fund the status quo. It is so much more expensive in so many ways to fund change, to fund progressive change. There are fails, there are losses, there's backlash, there's conflict. And yet through all of it, I wouldn't change a thing that we've been through here. And you know, we've had some wins, we've had losses, and I do feel that moment when I was looking up at Rashad, I felt like that was a challenge I was willing to take. And I'm very glad about it.
No, thank you all. I mean, I was just sort of connecting to your stories in a lot of ways, although I came from a very different background, being Indigenous, Native American. I got super politicized about a lot of this through my work in philanthropy, which I started very, very young. But there is just something about being in an industry that is about loving people and doing good in the world, and then getting behind the curtain up close and actually seeing those realities, as you said, Glenn, who has money in the first place to be able to do philanthropy or start foundations, and who makes the decisions and calls the shots inside those institutions and where that money goes. And I think it was pretty early in my career where we had a grantee convening in the foundation where I was working, and I looked around the room and I was like, I'm just with like a bunch of old white guys here, you know. No one from my community that is very, very poor is here receiving money. And that sort of, you know, made me aware of, even inside this industry, we see a lot of those dynamics of white supremacy playing out. So, well, I wanna pivot because there's so many juicy things to discuss based off what's happening in this moment. You know, as I was thinking last night and preparing for this, I remember, oh my God, the fight used to be just about to hire more people of color in philanthropy, and now look at where we are. I was doing some reading this week, and I want to quote my buddy Boulay, who wrote this about the moment we're in, that says, no, this is not a crisis like others. This is not like the AIDS epidemic. It is not like COVID. This is a rapid dismantling of democracy to replace it with an authoritarianism state. This is more akin to Hitler or Mussolini's rise to power. And debating whether the payout rate should increase to 6 or 10% is entirely missing the discussion we should be having. What does it take to halt and reverse the US's and the world's rapid descent into fascism? So that's a lot. That's heavy, but you know, Vu's words here are so reflective, I think, of what a lot of people are feeling and thinking through. in this moment. So I want to just kind of ask you all, as you've been navigating the day-to-day, chaos of the moment that we're in right now, what have you been most afraid of potentially or frustrated about, particularly for the philanthropic sector? So what are you processing and dealing with right now as a leader in this field?
You want to go first on this one? I mean, a lot. Um, uh, yeah, I mean, one of the things I'm angry about with this administration is that I wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, every morning thinking about these things you're lifting up. So in addition to what they're doing in the world, they're ruining my sleep. Um, the there are a number of ways to come at that question. We as a foundation, anticipated the election, and had worked on what we would say if the outcome of the election is what occurred. We felt it was extremely important in the wake of the election to let our grantees know that we were leaning in, that our focus on structural racism and connection to health, the focus on dismantling structural racism was going to remain our focus, our commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion as our way of operating was going to continue and going to mature. Our focus on equity as a goal for our work and our way of being was going to continue. And we have been very vocal about that since the election, and will continue to do so. We have a set of guiding principles, and every single one of our guiding principles is under assault at this time. One is about data and evidence that's openly debated, and the importance of truth and fact and science. Another is about treating people with fairness and respect. Another is about diversity and inclusion. Equity is the overarching umbrella. And then the last is that we speak out for what we believe. And I keep looking back at those principles, and they're holding me in a good position for this moment. And so I'm greatly concerned. You framed it up at the beginning. We were, as a foundation, we were not focused on issues of racial equity and health until 2020. And it was really a catalytic moment for us, COVID and murder of George Floyd and this national movement. And we started to do some funding around community power. We were doing some funding around reproductive justice. And there were two leaders in the racial justice movement. When I said, we're going to be funding, they said, great, how long are you here for? And I said, we're here for the long term. But as I said it, I couldn't guarantee it because there was a lot more work to do at our board level in engaging our trustees and making sure that they were learning and moving forward as I was. Work to do with our staff to make sure everyone was on board and we were moving forward. But over those next 4 years to today's moment, we did that work, and we have a board. Full disclosure, Edgar, you're on our board, but we have a board that is fully committed to this and thinks about risk in important ways. The risk of not speaking out, the risk to our grantees of not acting. One of my concerns in this moment is that I see a lot of leaders in philanthropy where the primary focus is what is the risk to our philanthropy, what is the risk to our endowment, what is the risk to us as an institution, and not enough focus on how are we there for the work, how are we there for the vision, for those things that we say we're truly about. How do we put our privilege at risk at a time when our grantees and I think the nation needs us to, as you said earlier, have skin in the game.
First, I just really want to express my gratitude to you, Rich, and to you, Edgar, being on the board of the foundation for putting out such a strong statement so quickly for all of us to lean on. It really, I don't know if the statement is on the YouTube channel or not, but I had the chance this morning to reread it. And so just tremendous leadership. And I'm personally grateful, and I hope you hear from others all the time about our gratitude for standing up so quickly and so strongly. You know, I have a podcast called Break Fake Rules, and it's really, it came out of the fact that our sector has a lot of rules that we impose on ourselves that really don't serve social change. Namely, a 5% minimum that most foundations treat as a maximum. An investment strategy that tends to be far more harmful than the grants we make, I believe. I don't have evidence to support that, but someday I will. I'm confident. And so on. And but in that podcast, I've kind of had to shift our direction a little bit. My producer, Claire Callahan, has had to do the same. And we're bringing on more people now to talk about what it feels like to be in the boiling pot of an autocratic takeover. We will have in the next couple of weeks Ann Applebaum joining us, who's probably one of the foremost speakers and thinkers on rising autocracy in the modern day. We are falling into the trap. There's no doubt. And one of the very powerful weapons, Edgar, you got one right there. Fear is a big one. And the strange thing about fear is that you can fear something without having experienced any kind of repercussion from an action you've taken yet. And as a result, people engage in what I think Timothy Snyder calls anticipatory conformism. And I'm seeing it all over the place. I'm in meetings with people who do not want anyone to know that they're in the meeting. They don't want their name listed. They don't want the discussion to be known in places where that was fine 6 months ago. The irony is I'm also in spaces with people who are literally on Kash Patel's list in his book, his infamous book. And those people right now I've experienced are far more outspoken than anyone. If anyone is going to get dragged before some kind of tribunal, it's them. And you can read their names, they're on the list. But they're speaking out right now. I cannot say the same thing about my philanthropic colleagues. And I just simply don't understand it. Why I can look to your statement, Rich, and say, there's the one, there's the one. There should be 5,000, 10,000. The world has not, in my knowledge of philanthropy globally, our system is a unique one in that we do have so many assets and organizations and institutions in a place called the third or social or philanthropic sector. And I think that's pretty unique in this, especially in this context and in context in Europe where autocracy is taking a grip, but there isn't as vibrant, at least in the way we have it here, counter movement, counter capital, all these things that could exist to take this on. I don't think it exists. You could, you know, I'm not an expert on European autocracies, but I get the sense that we're unique that way. We're unique that way for probably not the best reasons. We don't love to, we have a society that very much pushes back against caring for each other through the government system. So we've kind of dumped that onto this philanthropic system to do more of that. But we do have these assets and we do have these voices and we do have this time. And so while I am very empathetic to people wanting to think through the proper steps to be taken, at the same time, I just would ask, the call in is, let's not anticipate conformism. Let's go the other direction. There is nothing happening to us right now. I don't know of any philanthropic leader, foundation leader who's been dragged before any sort of tribunal, who has had anyone at their door yet pull them out. That day may come. But until that day, we should most definitely continue to speak out. And I think for white men in positions like ours, it is more incumbent than anyone. Because in many ways, this administration is very much trying to protect us in ways that I'm not asking. So let's go. I don't understand it. And so, again, I think your leadership, Rich and Edgar, I think is really important. People should read the statement, post the statement, put it out there. If you don't want to use your own words, say theirs. We've said ours. I've said things on LinkedIn about where we're headed, where we're standing at this time. And I really, I also have to say my gratitude. I didn't even know this organization until a month ago, the National Council on Nonprofits. I encourage everyone to follow Diane. I think it's Yatal's lead. She is posting every day, almost every hour, on motions and actions they're taking from their very small organization. It's a tiny little shop, and they are taking on a Goliath here. This is a true David and Goliath story. So there are heroes out there, and we should most definitely fall in line as best we can in a counter effort here, because the pot is starting to boil.
Absolutely. Thanks for naming that resource. Agree. I was just sharing with my team that they're killing it with the resources for us right now. No, thank you. I appreciate the remarks. I think that what you said, Glenn, in terms of like, where are the statements? Where is everybody? Where's the boldness in this moment? It's just something that I know that a lot of people are feeling. In my opening remarks, I kind of expressed that, as a person within this sector who has had a lot of favor and privilege and access to folks and everybody lining up to want to talk. A lot of those people are gone, and including progressive white funders. Many are still around. Not saying this is a blanket statement, but I am very proud that RWJ has taken a stand. And historically, RWJ was not known as a social justice foundation per se, but it's like, wow, this is an institution that has power and resources and money, and is not afraid to put that behind what it really believes in. And so there is this question that I know that I've had that, and I've talked to many, many people, that it's a question of like, who really has been in this with us all along? And it makes us question solidarity when we need folks the most, they are nowhere to be found. And, we can make assumptions about why all day long, but it is a moment where it's so much is at stake, and we need people to feel that solidarity. As you all said, some of your aha moments came about when you realized that in order to dismantle white supremacy is going to take white people understanding what they have to lose and have been losing because of white supremacy, and that it impacts all of us in different ways, but it impacts all of us. And so all of us must be at the table. I want to dig into a little bit more now, briefly, just what do you all think philanthropy should be doing right now? What is the push of putting out statements? That's great, but what are the things that we should be thinking about? There's debates around the payout. Of course, we need to be moving money. There's all kinds of things that folks are asking for. What do you all think philanthropy should be doing right now to respond in this moment?
Yeah, I think that there are a number of things. I'm not a big fan of the conversation focusing on what should the payout be and what is the number. We're at 6.5% more money. Our payout this year is highest it's ever been. That's not the conversation I want to have. The conversation I want to have is, what impact can we have by doing X, Y, and Z? Because I think there can be something self-congratulatory of pulling up a number and saying we hit this number. It's like, well, what are you funding with that number? What are you trying to accomplish? And are you speaking out about that goal that you're trying to accomplish? We're in the midst of looking at our funding across the board and saying, how does it line up with our focus and our goal of a future where health is not a privilege but a right? How does it line up with our goal about taking bold leaps to transform health in our lifetime? And how does it meet this moment where our democracy itself is under assault? And so we're looking to see where within our funding can we free up resources that are not aligned and say, okay, that was a great area to work in. but we're not going to be working there anymore. We're going to line up things to meet this moment. And then what additional dollars can we spend to have impact? I'm at a lot of different tables with heads of philanthropy, and I am encouraged that I'm seeing more action around democracy. I'm seeing more action around communication. We'll see how some of this matures, but time matters, and we can't take 3 years to get it perfect. We have to be supporting those who are really putting themselves at risk. And again, this is hashtag philanthropy so white, and I would just want to echo Glenn's comment that as privileged white men in these positions, we have so much less at risk than the people in general who were funding. And I have peers in philanthropy who are Black women, and I know that if someone's going to be targeted in philanthropy, it's much more likely to be one of them than it is to be me. And so leaning into this moment is really critical. I'm really proud of the work that our staff are doing to try and free up dollars and meet this moment, and we're going to continue to do that. And it's not, we as a foundation. We would like to exist in perpetuity. And part of that is that there are always issues that need to be addressed going forward. And that's a separate debate. But if this administration were to change the rules so payout goes up to 20%, there's a lot of good we could do over the next 5 years as we're spending down our endowment.
I try to look at this in short and long-term ways right now. In the long term, and I try to break it up into kind of 3 buckets using those 2. So just right there, I created a complex matrix. But first I think about voice, I think about assets, and I think about networks. And so first I'd ask, what are you saying in the short term? And what are you saying about the long term as a foundation? So in the short term, if you're silent, how are you setting up the long-term conversation about this fight for racial justice and equity? So I think there's a way to be vocal in the short term and a way to keep your voice also focused on long-term objectives. So I'll play that same dynamic out. If you think about assets, so I agree with you, Rich. I don't think it's good to get, and I'm probably if people follow me, they'll be stunned to hear what I'm about to say. I don't think it is about talking about percentages. I don't think that's particularly useful. We are a spend down. Our time is short. We'll be done in a couple of years. And in a moment like this, I really can't go out and say, we're going to do this much more, because we've got very little left to give. And we're pretty committed already. But what I would say, the question I asked, in fact, I posed this to John Palfrey of the MacArthur Foundation just this morning on LinkedIn. He was very generously having a conversation with many of us on LinkedIn this morning. And they are out there speaking in percentages. And I basically went back to him and said, the question we ask ourselves all the time, and I think I would encourage every foundation to do this, is to ask, why in this moment is it more important for us to hold on to these assets than the frontline organizations that need it? And there are reasons to. So that's not a rhetorical question. I'm actually encouraging leaders of foundations, and especially trustees, who I don't know how many are on this call right now, but trustees need to show up these days more than ever. And I know they like to hide out behind curtains, but now's the time. And ask that question, as you look out right now, why is it more important for you to hold on to these assets than the organizations on the front lines? And again, I'm saying, have an honest conversation with yourself, because I'm sure if you answer it honestly, you're going to have to say, okay, I'll do more. But you might also say, I don't want to yet, or I have other things that I want to focus on. And that's, in my opinion, fine. But ultimately ask yourself, are you being, and I'm speaking to trustees, are you being the best steward of public assets you can be in this moment? Are you taking the public's lead in this moment? Or are you leaning more toward what you need? And that's a tough one. Those are tough questions to ask. And it ties very much into the theme of what we're talking about. If you are a trustee, you are most likely white and privileged. And in this moment, as you are facing and experiencing a crisis, even if you're a white progressive, perhaps even more so, are you making decisions with the public's interest in mind when you make them for this foundation, or are you making them in your own interest? And that, I think, could change the game, because if you are answering honestly that I want to be more engaged in what the community wants, then it speaks to your short-term objectives and it speaks to your long-term objectives. And the community is, I'm pretty sure, going to tell you, sorry to go to percentages here, but it's the easy metric. I think the community is going to tell you, in this moment, it would be great if you could put out more than 5 cents on every dollar. That'd be cool. I don't think anyone is going to come back to you in any community right now and say, all we need is 5%. That'll work great. So I think that, in effect, drives the conversation. Are you being responsive to a public that's counting on you to steward public assets in their name? That's it. And then finally on networks, I'll say I've just had so much benefit of working with so many dynamic leaders of racial justice, racial equity organizations and foundations. I know, Rich, you mentioned this. We have this incredible access to amazing people in moments like this. And I think people are sincerely struggling. And so I'm not judging anyone. I really am not. It's a struggle to figure out that dynamic between short and long-term action. What do we do right now? And what do we do in the long term? In my opinion, stay the course on the long term. This is going to go, I hope this goes, Edgar, you started the conversation by saying, we'll get through. I hope so too. And I wouldn't want to sacrifice the long-term objectives we have for the short-term protection we need to put up there. If we have to, we have to. But it all comes back to that same question. When you're working in your networks, what assets are you putting out now? Are you putting out enough? Are you responding the way the community needs you to respond? And if you don't know, go talk to the community. Find out. And are you acting in the long term as well? It's complicated. That's a complicated idea. That's a dynamic that's very hard to lead through. But it's what we're being asked to do. So let's go. Let's do it.
That resonates with me in a big way. We have generational goals, and we are not backing away from our generational goals, while at the same time trying to figure out in this moment, what do we do differently? Because the generational goals are generational because we recognize that it is going to take that to accomplish them, and they're that big and that important that we don't want to lose sight of them. But also, if our democracy collapses, our chances of accomplishing them are about zero. So that there is that challenge of balancing those. That was really helpful for me.
Yeah, and like thinking about the long term, I have been in a number of conversations that for years folks have criticized philanthropy, especially progressive philanthropy, for not having that long-term vision and funding on election cycles, and saying, like, maybe look at how the right funds, right? The right has a long-term vision. They are investing heavily in leadership, and they are aligned around doing so for the long term. And whereas on our side, there tends to be just like not enough alignment around the issues and very short term. And sort of similar critiques of the Democratic Party kind of go and have the conversations and with communities of color when it around these election cycle times, but then are not there when the rubber meets the road, and it's time we really need folks to be there. So I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned around how we have failed community. And in this time, it is a time where I think that we can, try to right some of those wrongs by funding in a different way. A couple of thoughts here, and I just want to say, and then I want to tee you guys up for sort of a final question here before we invite Vanessa. I want you to be thinking about, how what's the call to action for folks here. But, I've been hearing just I think we don't have to ask community. People have been putting this out there. There is a cry for resources to move as much money as possible right now that the rainy day is here. And there are many things in place where, lots of infrastructure that has been built among BIPOC-led groups and organizations to partner with big philanthropy to get resources out to our communities. The pandemic demonstrated that that was an effective way, but we need to get resources to folks as soon as possible, and especially groups that have demonstrated that they know how to win. They know how to lead us through this and get us through this. The second that I've been hearing about and thinking about myself is just like, what is the role of philanthropy in those, especially with a lot of privilege and power, and taking the brunt of the hit potentially around some of these legal battles? And that speaks to our being so risk averse as a sector, right? If we come together around that 1.5 trillion, as you said, Glenn, there's a lot of money and a lot of power here, and we may need to think about a legal strategy to fight back. And using our power to protect those that they will come after potentially. But is there a millionaire or a billionaire or a foundation that's willing to say, no, we're going to fight this. We will stand up and we will take a legal strategy. There's a lot of fear there, and knowing that some folks or a group of folks will be willing to take that on would alleviate a lot of stress and fear, I think, in our communities. So there's are a couple of things. There's a whole list I have here, but just wondering if you have any quick responses to any of those thoughts before we move to the final question for you for now.
I align with what you're saying. I mean, I don't know if that magical billionaire is going to show up. I don't. I think they're out there. I think there's a chance that some will find their courage to step out and take the lead. For years now, the mysterious character has been George Soros that everyone on the right likes to point at. I often kind of laugh at that because I've seen some of the organizations that have been attacked as Soros grantees, and I can confidently say they're not Soros grantees, they're Stupsky grantees. But I appreciate Soros taking cover for us. I hope there are more Soroses out there that are willing to step in at this time and put up the money. But I do think, here's the way I look at it again. If you take the short and the long-term view on it, Edgar, I think the short-term benefit of spending assets on litigation will be, there's a huge risk there that you're going to lose. And if you lose, that new precedent is going to work against us. But there's also strong likelihood that the precedents that come from this litigation could cement a better future for us. And I look at some of these executive orders that the NCN is taking down one by one in courts, and I think, okay, this could start to put over time some real boundaries around an executive order that would protect assets that are supposed to be used by government for community rather than philanthropy having to fill that gap. So I do think there's a strong argument to be made for a short-term protection approach in litigation and to the benefit of the long term. And we will be, I'm positive, contributing to some of that here at Stupsky with what we have left. And for those of you that are looking, again, if I go back to my original comments, your community needs you to play these roles right now. And it may mean that your lifespan shrinks as a foundation, but my goodness, if you could establish a legal road that prevents this from happening again, what an incredible legacy you leave, even if you're gone. So that would be my take. And I think there are more and more examples of that. I hope that answers your question, Edgar. And, but I really, that's how I'm seeing it myself right now.
Yeah, I mean, we take a very much of a systems change approach to the work that we do, with a big focus around dismantling structural racism. And we built up a strong policy department, communications department. And in this moment, we're seeing a lot of our grantees being the leads on legal action. And so, in the short term, for sure, a strong legal approach is critical because it can slow down some of the change that we're seeing. Every day I'm seeing successes there. Right before this call, I saw something where a judge is saying that tens of thousands of federal employees who were summarily fired because they're in probationary periods have to be given their jobs back. These legal actions are absolutely critical as a way to say there is more than one branch here. We have an executive branch, we have a legislative branch, we have a judicial branch, and we need to lean hard on the judicial branch at this time to push back. And philanthropy has a critical role to play there. If it's not a space you're in, it's a space you should be in because there are more resources needed. We're constantly asking the question: Is this a place where joining an amicus brief would add value, where we can put some of our skin in the game? Is this a place where we should be a litigant? Is this something where we wouldn't add anything at all and it would just be work? But that's something the sector should be looking at hard. That is very much connected to a communications approach and strategy that's calling this out, that's calling out how wrong some of the things are that are going on. That's another area where I think it contributes to the short and the long run. And it's, I have to say for those of my colleagues who are sitting back and doing duck and cover, it doesn't make you safer, and it's not good for your mental health or the health of the people who work in your institutions. It is very good for the soul to be in the fight, and it's not just good for the soul; it's going to win.
Oh, I like that, Rich. Thank you. Had a chill when you said that. I want to just read a quote that I read this week from Michelle Morales, who is at the Woods Fund of Chicago. She said, "Funders have a decision to make while they still can in the face of these multiple, overlapping, and self-reinforcing crises. I have been challenging our sector to rethink our role as funders during a time in which federal funding is being weaponized and pulled from nonprofits doing the critical work in our communities. Do we sit aside and allow these nonprofits to close their doors or decrease their impact? Or do we release more funds, increase our payouts so that they, in turn, our communities continue to thrive during these unprecedented attacks?" This is less of a question and more of a call to action for all of us. So just we're going to invite Vanessa here, but I just wanted to see if there's any call to action briefly that you all want to put out. I will come back and give you a closing word, but any other call to actions that you're feeling led to put out there to your fellow leaders in the sector right now?
The only thing I would add to what I've already said is you need to engage with your board. If you haven't had a meeting with your board recently, you need to get one, and you need to talk about this and this moment and what your foundation should be doing in this moment. It's critically important. When I first started here, there's no way I would have been able to lean in the way that I can lean in now. And it's taken work with the board and the board feeling that this is the most important work we could be doing. But that takes time, and I recognize that not every philanthropic leader has the kind of board that I feel privileged and just so grateful for having, that is saying, how can you be bolder? And that's what boards should be asking their organizations.
I don't want to get in the way of Vanessa getting on here right now, so I'll just say very quickly, foundations are set up to benefit the donor. That's what they're set up to do. And they come with a lot of restrictions as a result. So I believe, and I would ask everyone at this time, to question in every way possible how this entity you are a part of is protecting you, and question how you can protect or help others protect communities under threat right now. Go against the grain of the structure you're working in my opinion. That's my call to action.
Awesome. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Rich. So I do want to invite Vanessa to come to share some reflections and hold a space of accountability here. We'll invite you all to come back and say anything at the end if you feel led to. But Vanessa Daniel, amazing, amazing friend and partner in this work. Vanessa just released a brand new book that just came out. I have my copy that's called Unrig the Game: What Women of Color Can Teach Everyone About Winning. It was published last week by Random House, and it shares the wisdom from more than 45 prominent women of color movement leaders and has been endorsed by Dolores Huerta and Latasha Brown, among others. And you can find out more about it, about the book and her tour that with some remaining dates at the link in the chat. And so Vanessa also has been a senior fellow at Decolonizing Wealth Project. And just thank you, Vanessa, for what you're doing. And we would love to hear from you now. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Edgar and Decolonizing Wealth Project, for having this really important conversation. And thank you, Richard and Glenn, for your reflections. I really appreciate all that you both have shared. You know, I wanted to talk about this point of risk that you both raised and what constitutes risk, how we're calibrating it. I appreciate your acknowledgement that as two white men, you have less risk than even other people of color that are in philanthropy. And, you know, I do think that it makes sense. White men led the way of us getting into this mess as a country. And so it makes sense that white men are doing some heavy lifting to help everyone who's being affected. So I appreciate you both for acknowledging that. You know, the critique that you offered, Richard, about, you know, people are worried about the risk to their endowments versus the, you know, understanding kind of the risk to the communities are under right now, and to put the idea of risk in context for folks who have so much privilege at a time when the nation really needs folks to step up. I think that that's really important. And this idea about, I want to push back a little bit on this idea that it's cheaper and easier and more efficient to fund the status quo, and it's expensive to fund outside of that. And I want to urge us to just recalibrate our idea of cost, because for years and years and years, people have been saying philanthropy, general support, multi-year, fund grassroots organizing. It's still only funded at 3%. Fund people of color, still only funded at less than 10%. Fund work that's led by women, also less than 10%. And it is, so I would say that it is extremely costly. And right now, it is costing us our democracy. The status quo of philanthropy is costing us our democracy, or the hope of democracy in this country. So, and then I also really, really appreciate your point, Rich, about just the risk that's not only to the bottom line or to, you know, legal status, but the risk to our souls. And I think that we need to sit with that. And we all have to be able to look ourselves in the mirror and look our kids in the eye and understand about whether we operated from courage or from cowardice in this moment. I want to pick up on the piece around payouts that both of you raised. And Glenn, I love the question you posed. Why is it more important for us to hang on to these resources than sharing them with communities? And what would communities say if you said, is it a good idea to give 5 cents more on the dollar? And what is it about, the clinging to that? I think that's really important. And letting go of that clinging is actually part of the liberation and the coming of people who are in privilege and in proximity to money back into greater alignment with their humanity. But, you know, this conversation about payouts, I really just want to say, tinkering around payouts is the equivalent of painting the bathroom while the house is burning. Like, there needs to be an opening of the floodgates of resources right now that asks the question, not what is calibrated to some strategy that is conceptualized in a thimble, but like, what is it going to take to beat a fascist threat and to rescue the hope of democracy in this country? That's the question. And we should be funding at that scale and that level. And as Ashley Woodard Henderson tells us, funding groups like we want them to win. I also want to pick up on this piece around process and the perfectionism in philanthropy. And, you know, we can plan and strategize forever, and perfection truly is the enemy of the good in our sector. The longest distance in philanthropy is always the distance between the conversation and the movement of money. And as you both have noted, we do not have time to engage in that. We can be strategic and also nimble and also proactive in this moment. This last piece around, Glenn, you mentioned voice, assets, and network. I really liked how you laid those out because it expands the idea of where privilege and access sits beyond just dollars, right? So donors can influence political figures. Donors can have a voice and a megaphone in rooms that grassroots communities are never going to get into. So I really love that you're surfacing the many facets of power and privilege that can be leveraged and used in this moment. And then this idea of anticipatory conformism. So you're absolutely right to challenge this obeying in advance. And there's so much about this moment that is really about how well we are going to be able to walk with our fear. And that is a question, and that is the muscle of how to walk with fear with backbone and integrity instead of cowardice and timidity is huge. It's something we all need to be working on. So I do want to say that none of us should be surprised by the backlash that we are experiencing right now in this country. Emancipation was followed by Jim Crow. Civil rights was followed by COINTELPRO and mass incarceration. There is no conceivable way that the largest protest movement in the history of this country and the uprisings following the murder of George Floyd was not going to be met with backlash. So the biggest problem we have as a nation is not the backlash itself, which is simply an indication that we made progress. The problem is that each time there's a backlash in this country, there's a swath of liberals, mostly white liberals, who deal with it by making concessions that throw other people under the bus in an attempt to appease, whether it's appeasing the Confederates, the Bull Connors, the Trumps of the world. It has never worked. It has always cost all of us. We can look at the Electoral College. That was a concession to appease the Confederacy. It has cost all of us because without it, Trump would never have had access to the presidency in the first place. Excluding Black domestic workers, mostly Black domestic workers from all the major labor protections in the 1930s, that was a concession to appease racists. It's haunting every single one of us today who are struggling to afford childcare and elder care. The cost of making concessions to appease Trumpers and Nazis in this moment is extraordinarily high. The price is allowing this country to plummet into fascism. And this is not a price that we can afford to pay. We must have the backbone to not make the same mistake of appeasement. And what that comes down to is stance. What is our stance? Now, here's the hard truth for philanthropy. And I think both of you are speaking to this and encouraging people to get into a better stance. But here's the hard truth. This stance of appeasement, compliance, timidity, obeying in advance, this risk aversion, this willingness to sacrifice the most vulnerable communities, to do the wrong thing that feels safe or popular instead of the difficult thing that is the right thing and then highest integrity. This is absolutely the dominant stance in philanthropy. This is the norm. This is true even on a good day, much less on a serious day like this one. So the first and foremost thing that each of us working in this sector need to do is shift out of that stance, shift our mindset from cowardice to bravery. Now, how do we do that? Well, first of all, we make peace with the fact that singing in the key of courage when the majority of the people in the sector are singing in the off-key note of timidity is going to feel uncomfortable. Know that. Be tough enough to deal with that. If immigrants can deal with fearing the knock on the door, if trans kids can deal with fearing persecution, people in philanthropy are strong enough to deal with that. And then know what to expect. Philanthropy as a whole, I guarantee you, as a sector, is going to go the gutless and spineless way of that Gavin Newsom, who is currently platforming Nazis like Steve Bannon on his podcast and throwing trans kids under the bus in California. It is going to go that way. So expect that. Prepare to move around it. And then how do you stay on the key of courage? You identify with brave people and you key off of them. So pick one or two movement ancestors who showed up with courage and integrity and identify yourself with them. And I want to say to white folks on this call, the only thing that the right wing has worked harder to deep six in history in our classrooms, then ethnic studies is the history of white folks who actually stood in real solidarity with people of color. Glenn, you talk about how white people are socialized. So look to your movement ancestors who opened their homes on the Underground Railroad, who joined freedom rides, who were part of the Jane Collective providing abortion care, who sheltered Central American immigrants in the 80s. I want everyone on this call to Google Joan Trumpauer Mulholland. Look up the Grimke sisters. Look at the work of Jane Fonda. And then once you do this, find your position and play it to the fullest. I do want to say that being brave doesn't mean that we're reckless. And it doesn't mean that everyone is going to have the same tactics. So people who have fought for freedom under authoritarian or fascist regimes have always had to figure out the best position for them to play. And they've always had to calibrate the level of risk they would take and then move according to that. So we think about Harriet Tubman, right? She didn't stand on a soapbox in the middle of the forest and give a speech about abolition, because not losing a single passenger on those journeys required stealth. Frederick Douglass spoke and wrote widely because his position required visibility. Similarly, we see white abolitionists in the North who are outspoken, and then those who were sheltering people on the Underground Railroad kept below the radar. So in philanthropy, we will need those who are loud examples of courage to encourage people away from timidity. Thank you, Richard, for your letter. Thank you, Glenn, for the words you're saying on this call today, and encourage people towards backbone. Others are going to move in a more subterranean way. So find your position and calibrate your risk and work accordingly. And then when you decide what you want to do, make a plan to do it. I do want to say something about who advises us in this sector, because if your lawyers and advisors are mainstream people who do not operate from a strong core of social justice values, you will need to find ones that do. And when you have these people, don't ask them whether you can do what you know to be the right and brave and necessary thing, but rather how you can do it. Ask them to help you find a way how to do it. And know that there may come a time when you decide that the moral risk of not doing the right thing outweighs the financial and legal risk of not doing it. There were good-hearted people of means who paid for trans people to have health care before it was legal, for abortion care prior to Roe, for land protections before any government regulations against drilling existed. There will come a time when we all need to ask, not just what the risk is of doing the right thing, but what the risk is of not doing it, not only to the hope of democracy, but as Richard says, to our souls. And as this image that's traveling around the interwebs reminds us, the people who sheltered Anne Frank were breaking the law. The people who killed her were following it. We have to look ourselves in the mirror. We have to look our kids in the eye and answer for whether we showed up with backbone or cowardice in this moment of history. The last thing that I want to touch on is this concept of being like water. So how do we be like water in getting resources to the front lines? And I want to encourage people to think outside the box about your giving in this moment. Philanthropy and donors are tenaciously determined and creative in figuring out tax shelters and write-offs. So how can we bring that same creativity to figuring out how to get money to the front lines of movements? Wealthy people have found ways to get money to the front lines throughout history. I want to plug my friend Dimple Abichanandani's new book, A New Era of Philanthropy, that has practical tools for some ways that we can engage in this. But I want to also lay out a few options and a menu of things to just throw out there to help folks start to think outside the box. So can you front load grant disbursements to get them off your books early and into the hands of organizations, particularly multi-year grants? Pay out the full grant now. Is there a set of high impact leaders or organizations who you could commit to flanking for the next 4 years to ensure that they have the security, the resources, and what they need to continue their good work? Is there land or property that you could either donate or allow movement formations to borrow for meeting space, food and supplies, storage, or even safe houses? Property owners have done this around the world. Are there assets you can liquidate? If you're sitting on rainy day funds right now, it is pouring, y'all. In order to help those that are serving the most impacted communities, we need to open the floodgates in this moment. Seek out those who are protecting undocumented immigrants, transgender people, pregnant people seeking abortion. Can you use your network and political influence with elected officials to jam the gears of authoritarian policies and regulations? Can you give a no-cost loan or PRI to a movement organization that's reconfiguring as an LLC? Can you fund grassroots organizing? And the thing I want to say about this is that our power to fight fascism ultimately is fueled by money, but it doesn't come from money, it comes from people. And it's directly proportionate to our ability to organize regular people at scale for long enough to shift systems and to regain the power to govern. We don't have a problem in this country with people agreeing with us. The majority of this country is with us on everything from abortion access to addressing climate justice to gun control. We also don't have a problem attracting people. We have had the largest protest movements in this country in the last 10 years that we have seen in the history of this nation. What we have is a retention problem. What we have is a conversion problem. We have not been able to convert these flashpoint moments like the Women's March, like the uprisings following the murder of George Floyd, into sustained engagement. And part of that is because philanthropy funding organizing, 3% funding of organizing gets us exactly what we're seeing right now. We need to open the floodgates to supporting people who are doing grassroots organizing led by the most impacted communities on the ground. This is one of the most important things that any of us could be funding in this moment. I want to end by just saying that if, in any and everything that we're doing, let's take our direction from those leaders and organizations with a demonstrated track record of delivering change for frontline communities and who those communities trust the most. Okay, I'm not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. But this is just my reminder to everyone that people with resources and creativity have always found a way, and we can all of us find ours. We can do this. So thank you all so much.
Vanessa, thank you. That was the word that we all needed for the day. And just appreciate your years and years and years of work in this sector to move resources, but to just modeling that and always holding us accountable to do better. And so thank you. So powerful. We will be sharing this, y'all, because we need to listen to that 3 times. 3 times to get and more to really soak in the challenge today. So thank you for also just giving me very tangible things that people can take from this call to do. And so we are left without excuse to take action. There is a way to be creative to step up our support in this moment. We are moving toward a close. I did want to ask Rich or Glenn if there's any final just words you want to say before I wrap us up here. All good. Okay. I know that's difficult to follow. We love when Vanessa has the last word, so thank you. In closing, I just want to say to folks that there's this quote. I think this was also from an article with VU that is just sticking with me, and it's the question of funders should ask themselves: if we knew in 2 years there would be no more fair elections, no media to criticize the government, get sued or disbanded, and its journalists jailed, any organization accused of engaging in DEI is shuttered, protests are declared illegal, and protesters and anyone who helps them get arrested, and we are branded as a terrorism funding foundation, and our endowment gets seized, how would we act, right? And so the rainy day is here, as Vanessa said. The writing is on the wall that things are moving into a horrible place, but there's time left now to move as much money and to use our powers as much as we can to keep us from falling completely into this dark place. So I want to thank Vanessa for your powerful words. I want to thank you, Rich and Glenn, for joining us today, for being vulnerable, for sharing, for doing what you can, for helping us to push others in this sector using your voice and resources. Everyone get Vanessa's book. If you felt what I felt, there's so much more there that you can read and be inspired by. And join our movement here. We've been building for 5 years plus here at Decolonizing Wealth. We are always speaking the truth in love. We're creating on-ramps for people to be a part of this. Ways to keep up is to go to our website, decolonizewealth.com, sign up for our newsletter. Upcoming events are also there, and you can join the Liberated Capital community. Whether you have $5 or $5 million, we don't care. There's a way there for us to pull our resources to fund the kind of work that we need to be funding right now in this moment. So we invite you to go to our website to learn more. Until the next Philanthropy So White, we hope that we don't have to keep having these in the future, but we like having this space to hold us accountable and to help create a vehicle for white people to collect their people. Until the next one, we'll be here leading the way as best we can. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. Thank you for your questions. Please share the word and stay tuned for more resources that will come out from this very powerful conversation today. So much gratitude. Love and peace to everyone. Thank you.